Good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much. Welcome to the March meeting of the Global Learning Center. Tonight, our speaker will be Professor Colby Clark, a visiting assistant professor of philosophy at Wichita State University. Colby is a 2023 graduate of the University of Kentucky. His director was Ted Shotsky, who I've met and who is one of those academics who is intimidating as heck because he's just so dang smart. Colby himself also has a master's degree from Kent State University and a bachelor's degree from Wittenberg University. The last couple of years he has been a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Utah Department of Philosophy. He has publications in philosophy of science, the Journal of Philosophy of Science, and then another one, something or other.
We're going ethics, policy, and environment.
Ethics, policy, and environment. And he has a number of other works that are under review at this time. So he is a peripatetic young academic on the market, looking around, and I'm very pleased that he saw fit to be able to come tonight and share some of his research with us. And I'm interested, I think as a philosopher and as a person who is aware of my environment and aware of the changes that are happening in our environment. So his talk this evening is entitled "The Expansion of Sense of Place Values as the Environment Becomes Unrecognizable." So, would you please welcome Professor Colby Clark.
Thank you so much for everybody being here. And I know, I guess I should first say, Chris mentioned my Ph.D. director, and he is a high operating intellectual. I am unfortunately not. So, but I love talking about these projects, and I know that there's a ton of expertise in this room. And well, make sure, I've got it switched over on the Zoom. Do I got it over there, right? Let's see if I got it. I'll make sure that. Let's see, pull up the Zoom real quick. All right, share my screen. Screen two. All good?
It's on.
Sweet.
It says video's off.
No, that's good.
Okay.
So, I guess in preparation for this talk, I've been working on this paper for the past week since we've been on spring break, and it's been a little bit under construction. I'm not so convinced by the title, so what I wanted to make sure was that I gave you a ton of examples in this to make it worth your time and enjoyable. I try to use a lot of pictures, and then I'm hoping that you'll be willing to help me out on the thesis here because it's slightly weak right now. With that being said, like I said, I want to sort of give you a number of examples to motivate why I'm using a specific type of framework, and then try to make an argument about how we should be thinking about sense of place values in the future. But if you're, I thought I would start off with an example of sense of place values. This is probably the most common one. I'm not from California, I'm from Ohio. I was in LAX once, so I don't have an attachment to California, but if you know anything about the state of California, they have the grizzly bear on their flag, and there hasn't been a grizzly bear since 1924. Flags are usually these representations of our place that we like, oh, this is where I'm from, these are the type of cultural things that I'm associated with, and here's an example of a state that has a flag that bears something that that doesn't exist anymore. Yeah, I was not planning that pun. But this is the idea of like losing sense of place values over time. The other example I wanted to sort of give, and I'm not an alarmist or, I don't, especially since I'm a philosopher, I'm a wannabe biogeographer and a climate scientist that likes to dabble, which you'll see here in a little bit. But I was thinking about the Shocker logo, which you had corrected me on Thursday, right? It's a shock of wheat. And if you look at some of the current projections, there was an assessment about 2050, what the state's going to look like, and reduction in the amount of wheat production and more diversified with crops because of the water intensive nature of wheat. So it's like, oh, here's going to be a symbol of Wichita State that's going to be there, even though over time its prevalence within the state is going to diminish. And so it's this really interesting situation in which we have these attachments to places that are embedded in our like lived experiences, and yet they're going away. And what does that mean moving forward? So I also better keep track of my time, just in case. So here's the outline. The idea is to sort of define what sense of place values are, and then try to give a framework for understanding their accelerated loss. And then I put expansion in scare quotes because I'm not as committed to that term now, but I'm hoping that you all can help me through this once we get towards the end, which again, I'm going to be very happy to take any questions and any advice on this paper because it is very much still a work in progress right now. But once we get to there, then talking about what these sense of place values might look like, and then just concluding. My thesis is going to be that the geographical setting supports this renewed sense of place values and how the future policies can sort of tailor themselves towards that as a motivation for these projects. So a little bit more about that later, and that image will come back up a bit later too. So to start, what are sense of place values? In human geography, that's where sense of place values really start. You have Yi-Fu Tuan, Doreen Massey, and David Harvey. They're sort of the first ones that come to publish on this idea of sense of place value. And the whole idea is that it's based on experience. Like our understanding of place is based on how we experience it and interact with it. Ted, who is, again, was my director, is somebody who works in the sociology, geography, philosophy realm. And, philosophers have been very interested in this idea about how space is, there's a distinction between space and place. Space is this physical world in which we all live in, but place is something that we build through our experiences and things like that. So in environmental ethics specifically, though, there's been this interest in what's called relational values. And this diagram that you see on the right-hand side of the screen is from probably one of the most heavily cited papers in environmental ethics recently. It's up to like thousands of citations, but the diagram is very helpful. So in environmental ethics, we have intrinsic and instrumental values. Those are the basic ones that you have heard on among a number of different circles. Instrumental value, think of like a hammer. A hammer has instrumental value insofar as it can be used to do something. Intrinsic value insofar as value being the type of thing that it is. So people usually have intrinsic value. We say, right, it's wrong to use a hammer, it's wrong to use a person in the way that you would use a hammer. So this binary of intrinsic instrumental value dominated environmental ethics for a very long time. But there's been this push for relational values. And it's a very simple concept insofar as we all have different familial connections and we build these values by our experiences with other people, with nature, right? If you have a favorite park that you like to go take a hike in, or you have a favorite restaurant that you like to go to, you build these experiences and you create this relational value between it through that experience. And so environmental ethicists have been trying to push for this relational view of our interactions with nature to motivate why people should get on board with certain policies or certain management initiatives. And so within this relational value category, sense of place values is a subcategory within it. And so sense of place value has three sort of distinguishing features. The first one is that they're particularly strong motivators for action, right? We usually act to protect or save things that we care about, right? And by having that relationship with a thing means that we're ultimately going to be more inclined to put ourselves at an inconvenience to help save it in one way or another, right? I usually think of the example of would I donate a kidney to a random stranger? I would like to think that I'm that great of a person, but I would be hesitant. Donate a kidney to my brother, more than likely, right? Because there's an attachment. If you knew my brother, that would be the same response too. We don't have the greatest relationship, but I'd still feel responsible in some respect. In any case, sense of place values, they instill this motivation for action. The second part of sense of place values is that they're bound to a particular geographical setting, meaning coordinates in physical space. And this is one of the other things I've been tossing around as I've been working on this project for the past week, maybe changing that to physical space, or physical place. But in any case, when I mean geographical coordinates, I mean just like if you were to put in your GPS, where do I need to go to? Every sense of place is bound to this specific region or area within physical space itself. And then it also has a historical context. There's a story that we can tell about these sense of place values. Just like with the grizzly bear and also shocker, we can tell a story about why that's the thing that we embrace as a symbol for the different institutions. And then finally, sense of place values occur at the local scale, meaning that our experiences of sense of place values cannot exceed a certain scale because they become too large. I'm going to try to motivate this as we get going, so I'm going to table it for right now, but you'll see what I mean by scale, and it's going to play a very important role. This is the expansion part that was originally in the paper. So, with that, this is one of my favorite diagrams. This is when I sort of transitioned into the resilience theory stuff that I love. I'm a philosopher who likes to masquerade as a biogeographer, climate scientist type person because I like to read all that stuff. And in any case, philosophy gives you the freedom to do it, in case you want to double major in philosophy. Just thinking. All right. So this is what's called an adaptive cycle. This is something that came from C.S. Holling, who's one of the premier people in resilience theory. I think last time I checked, his 1973 paper has like over 20,000 citations, so a lot of people gravitate towards this. Not that that makes it necessarily correct, but at least it's rooted in something that is widely believed. So the adaptive cycle here is all about the transition of processes to create an organizational structure that persists over multiple times. So the story is that we have these 4 different stages of the adaptive cycle. I'm just going to put them all up here for right now. I usually like to start in the exploitation phase because the idea is that, think about after a big storm or a hurricane or a big fire and the area is bare, right? Anything can move into that place, right? Everything wants to exploit that new open space that no longer has any structural organization to it. And so it's a mad rush to try to establish oneself. Over time, once you get towards the conservation phase, the processes become more, they become stronger between different individuals that then isolate other invaders from coming into the system. In island biogeography theory, there's the idea of assembly rules where K or carrying capacity species, this is more me of geeking out on this stuff, and you don't have to know it, but the idea is that species that establish later, you can usually resist invaders later, and so it becomes very efficient. But that efficiency causes it to be prone to collapse, so that's the release phase. And then that release phase means that now everything is available again. Then you have this reorganization where there's this other mad dash, but there's also a retention of things like soil, biomass, things like that. But in general, I like this diagram and understanding sense of place values in this way, because just as we experience seasons everywhere, right, you can have a different sense of place value during spring and summer, winter and fall. And so our understanding of sense of place value isn't necessarily that something's always present, but it's present within a story that we can tell, right? And as I was saying before, there's more diagrams here, so I don't want to give it away, but I'm going to have to thank Chris Fox for taking me on a little nature tour. So some of those examples pop up, and you can thank him for that.
Or blanket.
I hope they're not giving you. In any case, so this is an adaptive cycle. And the next part is where the scale aspect comes into this. So the idea is that adaptive cycles, these movements from low connectivity to high connectivity to release to back to the same progression of processes, they're actually nested within adaptive cycles. It's adaptive cycles all the way up and all the way down. And so when resilience theorists are looking at these sort of organizational structures that persist over time, like the way in which we can say these are going to be present here even though they're not present right now, ultimately the processes will renew eventually and the things will reappear. They like to understand it in this more hierarchical interpretation. So again, I'm just going to put all this up here. I'm not a big fan of having people read a ton, so hopefully I can just talk through it. But the idea here is that the adaptive cycle at the focal level, so that's the one that's in the middle, right? There's an adaptive cycle that's above it, and there's an adaptive cycle below it. In most cases, when we're thinking about these, I'm going to give you an actual example of a panarchy here on the next slide. And again, I want to make sure that I'm not going too fast. Or, yeah. But the idea is that the adaptive cycle at the level above constrains the focal adaptive cycle, and the one at below also pushes it into a different release phase. The idea here is you don't really have to understand the nuances to this, but more so that there is a historical narrative to be told about why these things are the way that they are, and that they can have this sort of structure to them. So again, I like to give an example. And the Amazon rainforest is the easiest one, and then I'll give you one that's more central to Kansas. But if you think about the Amazon rainforest, there is an ecosystem within the Amazon rainforest. I think we can all agree with that. If you send an ecologist to the Amazon, they'll find something to study, and they'll be able to mark off the boundaries to it. So imagine here, if we imagine the spatial scale of a study of an ecosystem, it's usually a small set of a larger area. There's also what's called the Amazon rainforest water pump. So there are these processes. What keeps these the Amazon is that you have all of this vegetation. It's very dense. Through the water that evaporates, so the evapotranspiration, that's just the process of leaving the trees and entering the atmosphere. That's what causes all the humidity, which causes it to rain again. Again, you don't have to know the processes to get this, because again, I'm just sort of masquerading as a scientist. I'm not a real scientist. Us philosophers just like to pretend. But I know it enough to be able to see that there's a cycle here that stays within a certain state because the processes are discernible in a certain way. And a lot of the fear for the Amazon going away is that if you deforest it, you reduce the threshold of the trees that are available. Now you don't have the sponges that soak up all the water, and all the water is just going to wash away the nutrients, and then you lose the Amazon. But in any case, if we want to understand the Amazon, we understand it at a larger spatiotemporal scale. So we have a system within a system. And then if you, I don't know if anybody's ever heard, sometimes during, I think it's usually in the fall, where you'll see a news story about, oh no, Sahara dust is depositing over Florida and you should watch out. That's usually because it's not going where it typically goes, which is into the Amazon, because that's where a bunch of the nutrients and minerals go to nourish the Amazon rainforest itself. So if we look at this structure, we can think about why the Amazon rainforest has a specific structure over time at different spatiotemporal scales. We can think about the small ecosystem within a small place of it. We can think about the whole Amazon rainforest. We can think about towards including Africa, and you can also think about including the whole world, because this is where you'll catch me later. But tipping points in the climate and its connectivity to these different elements all around the globe. So the whole idea is just to say, when we understand why nature has certain values, we have to understand that these values are bound to certain spatiotemporal scales. And so here's the more appropriate example given Kansas. again, have to thank Chris Fox for this. So when we went to the nature preserve, right, they have those canisters full of the grass,
The blue stem.
the blue stem,
Grass.
blue stem grass. And I was gonna say, it had different canisters with different lengths of them, and you could see how far down the roots go for the prairie grass compared to the agriculture there on the right. So what could ultimately happen? So if you talk about changes to the prairie landscape, imagine with warmer temperatures and you'd have drier vegetation, which would lead to more intense, more frequent fires, and the desiccation there to the grass, and also become more susceptible to diseases and things like that. But if you think about what would happen with a fire regime that ultimately sped up, you would lose all of the root system, and it would just get completely burned, and you could get this sort of dust bowl situation. That's the idea. That's one direction that you could go. The other direction is if you have less grazers, so less herbivores, which obviously, historically losing the bison, things like that, can allow for this woody encroachment. And if you have infrequent fire because you have a no fire policy, and then also disease can play a role here, and then you get more of a woodland, shrubland type situation. And this is all just to say that Kansas has a certain attachment to the prairie view, the prairie grassland. Like when we think about Kansas in the middle of the country, we think about that. But really there are all these different forces on different scales that could ultimately make this go away, and that would be for me, I think, a loss of a sense of place value. Because we think about this place, or we see this and we think backyard. So, I'm gonna do it on time. No hard time. So, to sort of put this into the language of sense of place values and what I'm trying to do with it, whether or not I'm successful or not right now, that's what I'm trying to figure out, is that these adaptive cycles can help us understand sense of place values as a historical process within a specific place and a spatiotemporal scale. And the fear is that as these panarchies compress, which I'll show you what I mean by that with another example here in a second, these sense of place values will become more vulnerable over time. So this is another image that I like. This is from species translocation. So I got your back Benny case, right? There you go. There's an extra example. So this is from South Africa, but this is one of the, this is from a very popular species translocation article, and it just shows you these different sort of, I guess biomes, but I would imagine more ecosystem level type stuff, and how it's shrinking. And the whole argument within the paper is that as you start to lose those spaces, you lose the species that are associated with them, and you feel obligated to move them. And again, if we think about the California grizzly bear example, there's a sense of place value that seems to be shrinking and expanding insofar as these things are going to be moving and changing the landscapes. So these things that we have personal identity with, they seem to always be vulnerable to these more accelerated changes that are happening. So my thought, what's the motivation for this paper, is that these changes will ultimately mean that sense of place values will be lost or fewer and less distinct. And if you remember from before, there's strong motivators to get people to actually engage. And so we want to be able to say, here are these sense of place values, here's why you should be invested in our management strategies, and why you should care. So here's the general idea of how I'm thinking about this in my head. I'm not married to this, so again, if anybody has any feedback and think differently, I am all open for it. But in a healthy, that's probably a loaded term to use for this, but in a natural setting, these panarchies are, again, nested in such a way that the higher level constrains the focal level, the lower level constrains the focal level as well, and that there's not as much space between these. And I'll show you what I mean on the next slide with some Kansas examples. But I think, and I would imagine that most of the literature supports it in one way or another, that ultimately these adaptive cycles at different scales are going to compress insofar as they're going to start moving quicker. So they're going to speed up, and then the gap between them will cause more uncertainty and have these different values that are associated with each adaptive cycle be more vulnerable. That's the thought. So to show you what I'm thinking of, here is another example from our trip on Thursday that came to mind. And if you're interested, the thing that says Bill Spruill, Dung Beetles on the Prairie. It's a very good video, and it talks about a lot of things I'm talking about in here. It's actually an agriculture scientist, or it's a farmer talking about the way in which fire regimes, grazers, and different processes across different scales, water availability and things like that, create a more sustainable agriculture farm situation for him. So it's a very good video. I've got it in the link for the slide, so in case if you're interested. But here's the general idea. So in the research that I did, I'm not somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like dung beetles play a pretty fundamental role on the prairie. And dung beetles are small scale insects. They reproduce quite quickly. And smaller scale, you don't expect them to go super wide in their dispersal, more local, faster processes, more turnover time. So that would be lowest spatiotemporal scale. Then you have something like prairie dogs that operate at another scale above that one because they're a little bit more dispersed. They don't move as much as the bison do here as the third example, but they've got a larger spatiotemporal range than the sort of the cycles of different dung beetles. Granted, you can have the dung beetles distributed over a same area, but the cycles in which they are embedded in would be at different times within their own adaptive cycles. So that's one part. And then bison, again, you think larger spatiotemporal range than a prairie dog, and then a blue heron further yet. So all of these seem to overlap with one another, and they create this type of structure that is consistent. And this is sort of the idea of resilience, is that if you have more species that overlap in their scale, the more likely that if you lose one, you don't lose the processes, things usually stay about the same. But the suspicion is that with habitat fragmentation, climate change, that these gaps between them will ultimately shrink. And by shrinking, I'm thinking smaller populations, more susceptible to diseases, and so the gaps between them will not be as overlapping as an ideal situation would be. And so I think that this is a situation in which sense of place values could be quite vulnerable, and we can understand these changes over time using these different frameworks here. Okay. With that in mind, so I'll make sure that I'm off time too. Yeah. So here is where I make the transition to what my thesis is, and again, it's sort of a weak thesis, and I feel stronger about the framework, which is why I tried to give you as many examples as I could. So I hope that I hope that you don't leave here feeling like I wasted your time, but I'm going to try to give you the best version of the thesis that I can think of right now, and I'm gravitating towards it. So this idea of the expansion of sense of place values. So we make these connections with the things that we experience in our local vicinity. There's this idea of time-space compression, where if you think about technology and capitalism, right, it's been this push for globalization. we're more connected with people than we were 150 years ago. I can email a friend from over, across the world in the matter of seconds, when 100 years ago it would have taken months to have a communication with somebody that far. And so there's this idea in human geography called time-space compression, which is to say that our world has shrunk. And that's what this image is supposed to represent, where it seems like our world is getting smaller and smaller, meaning that we're more connected. I also think of like globalization in agriculture. So I used to teach food ethics at the University of Kentucky, which I really enjoyed. Miss teaching. But one of the topics that we always talked about was food sovereignty. And so food sovereignty, having the rights to be able to decide what you grow. And like in contemporary times, we have different countries growing all of these different crops that we're going to use for like McDonald's fries or coffee or these commodity crops. And so there's this globalization to get everybody to grow the same thing, and everybody's on the same market. And I think that there is a similar thing that is happening with our experience of nature, or what will happen with our experience of nature, where we'll start to understand it at a larger spatiotemporal scale. This was where the expansion was supposed to come from. I'll tell you a little bit more later about why I think that's the incorrect term. But the idea here is that as these things become more stretched out, more sped up, that these sense of place values will ultimately get lost. Or people will start to think about nature only on a global scale. So in resilience theory, there's this push for planetary stewardship, which is to say we should be thinking about how we're interacting with the planet and how even our small interactions can affect global processes and things like that. There is the phrase of eco-cosmopolitanism, which I just came across. And again, my fear is that if you shift the experience of nature to these more larger scales, you're going to lose out on the sense of place values and how they can be helpful for achieving certain goals. That's the idea. With that in mind, so have a couple of observations. The first observation is that if we jettison this idea of sense of place values at the local scale, and we just accept that these changes are going to happen, we have to also accept that these historical contexts will be broken, and that the things that we value like as part of our history, right? If you ever had like a restaurant that you really enjoyed growing up and you go back to your hometown and it's not there anymore, and then you have to start thinking about, oh, I know that the pizza scene, at least in this city, is good. I've lost my specific joint, but I can go to a number of different ones, and like there's this expansion of how I experience the food culture within a city and things like that. And I think a similar thing will ultimately happen as we lose these sense of place values, and that's worrisome for a number of different reasons, but I think here the first part is that this historical context we're going to have to just sort of jettison, and that's a big deal in a lot of different cultures if you just say, well, I'm just going to deny the history because it's been broken and now we have to just move on to a different interpretation of what's happening. The second observation is that, again, sense of place values are powerful because they motivate us to do something and get involved. If you talk about species translocation across a whole nation, or you talk about geoengineering, or you talk about, I just slipped there, but in any case, if you think about large-scale management practices, you usually say, oh, they're going to take care of it. This is technology's problem. They're going to fix it. I don't have to do anything in my backyard. We just care about the planet. And so you lose that motivation for the stakeholders where we just all like just shrug our shoulders and say, somebody else will fix this. I'll just keep moving on. And that's, I think, to the detriment of any practical outcome of environmental policy. You want stakeholders to be invested, not just indifferent. So I think that's a major reason why we want to be careful about losing these sense of place values. And the last bit is that for the people who do lose sense of place values that they're very deeply connected to, so especially in indigenous cultures, indigenous science and indigenous philosophies, part of this is about being able to tell a story, between generations and being able to have this connection to where you live. And if you ultimately tell stakeholders a lie, insofar as like, we're going to return these sense of place values to how they were, you're going to break this level of trust with the stakeholders, and then they're not going to buy into the policies that you're going to suggest to them either. So there's this honesty aspect, I think, because trust is central to management outcomes, and we can't just say it's going to be easy to reverse all the damage that we have caused. Because ultimately that's the whole tipping point part and the irreversibility of these changes to these sense of place values. So to sort of motivate why I was thinking about this as one of the early images is if you show the picture on the right to somebody and say, you should care about this place, they're gonna be like, no, it's already dead, it's gone, I shouldn't care. Or it's going to get moved because coral reefs getting moved further up in latitudes is part of the species translocation plans. And again, it's like, okay, I'm going to lose these things that I had a cultural connection to, this relationship with. Why should I be motivated to care about these things anymore? And that's the part that I worry most about when it comes to the loss of sense of place values, is that care and concern about being involved and invested in these different policies. So here is, okay, I just got like 2 or 3 more minutes. Good with that? Everybody good with like 2, 3 minutes? Okay, cool. So here is the positive thesis. The geographical setting ultimately anchors our experience. We know that we are in Wichita, and I can give you if you give me a map, I can sketch you the boundaries of Wichita, and I know that I live in Wichita. I know that I live across the street, which I didn't expect to be. But in any case, like, we have a physical place that we can associate ourselves with. It's specifically here, and that anchors our experience. The other part of my thesis is saying that future policies should motivate local stakeholders to care about these geographical settings, independent of the relationships with the things that occupy those, the immediate space that we live in. So even though we might lose the species or our favorite restaurants or things like that, there's sort of a way in which we can salvage the connection to these sense of place values, even though the original bearers of sense of place values no longer exist in the same state as before. Then I think the final part is making sure that we communicate to stakeholders what geographical settings value is to these different adaptive cycles, so we can understand how where we live contributes to a sense of sustainability, even if it's not in the same spatio-temporal scale that we're used to experiencing. And I'll show you what I sort of mean by this. This is me, again, wanting to be a wannabe geographer, but there's a lot of senses in which geographical structure in space can facilitate or moderate different processes in their speeds as they occur. So stepping stones can slow down dispersal rates. Source sinks, that's that one on the top right. Source sinks are situations in which you have a source population that can also provide for the establishment of a species in a place that they could not normally exist because the conditions aren't right. It's just like an overflow situation. Then there are just filter effects that happen because the topography has a certain variability. It slows down different processes. Think about trying to run on the road versus run on the beach, right? You gotta move a lot slower in the sand than you are on concrete. So filter effects, and then also corridors in making connections to these different spaces to enlargen the sort of the functional space for these things. And I think the role here for policymakers and like why we should retain sense of place values is to understand that our places function in certain ways to contribute to the sustainability that happens. And how can we understand that even though our places might not look the same way that they used to, how might they contribute to a sort of permanence later on. So with that, this is a conclusion here. I just figured I'd try to wrap things up. And again, I'm not completely convinced of that thesis, so if anybody has any comments about it, I'm more than happy to take your advice. But here, just to recap, the notion of place is rooted in experiences, and it's very complex and relational. And the sense of place values have these three distinguishing features. The first one is that they're strong motivators. We usually care about sense of place values because it's something within our own backyard. And then they're bound to a specific geographical setting and a historical context. They're usually local in scale. It's hard to experience the planet all at once, right? Like we can only experience so much of it. And then the argument here is that the rapid transformation of these sense of place values are going to ultimately cause local stakeholders to be less invested in policies and management changes. And these different frameworks I showed you, the adaptive cycle and the panarchy, can sort of help us understand, communicate how those sense of place values are changing over time. And my positive argument here is like trying to communicate to these stakeholders the way in which the geographical setting can actually support these management goals and initiatives. And there's still this attachment to our place that is providing a certain service to these larger interactions between different systems. Thank you.
There is time for questions. Would you like me to moderate, or do you want to do it?
Or either, I'm fine with.
I think you're in there.
That works for me.
Well, this is Kansas.
Yeah.
In 1859, Kansas expelled very tribes from which this state is named. They had to go down to reservations. We had a matriarch, Roddy Billings, some years ago, who's been known to say, when you leave the animals, the environment behind out of your life, you've really lost your soul. How do we really convey that to the stakeholders, these capitalistic notions of land and things to be exploited, resourced, mined, drilled, whatever? How do we do that without having to kill the plant?
Right. So indigenous philosophy, like Kyle White and Robin Wall Kimmerer, if anybody familiar with Braden Sweetgrass, I think that's where the relational values concept is actually stemming from, are mainly indigenous sciences and philosophies. And so, yes, part of my thinking for this project is like, how do we get people motivated, or at least how do we get Western-minded people to be motivated about getting invested in these different projects? And so bringing in, especially different groups, this is another aspect of what I've been working on recently. One of the mini papers that I would hope to finally get through the finish line is about how when we're using geographic information systems, so GIS, right? So like remote drones or like remote sensing, right? There's a big push in that literature to bring in indigenous scientists to make sure we're working with the individuals within those regions, because it's really knowledge is a co-production, and that ultimately whoever is tasked with the management has to be able to understand the reasoning behind these different decisions. And so I think to your question, my push has always been that you need to expand your understanding of what counts as knowledge, and you also have to incorporate more stakeholders and bring more people to the table. And ultimately, if you do that, you'll get the people who are invested in the place itself, rather than just these people who just travel. Like, I imagine, one aspect of the GIS issue is that you have these, university scientists, no offense to anybody, who go to these poorer countries and then say, we're going to just do all this stuff, we're going to take all your data and we're going to take it back and then we'll tell you what you need to know from it. And there's this real paternalistic aspect to it. And so the motivation for the sense of place values in this is really to say, we don't have this experiential connection that we used to, that we really are going to need to get ourselves out of the hole that we've dug for ourselves. That's all.
That's a very good word.
I hope that I can contribute to it.
So, thanks for the interesting talk. I agree with, the sense of place importance, but I would challenge you on the point that, it's that coral reef picture.
Yeah.
When there's lots of healthy corals, you take them for granted and you let tourists interfere with them and damage them. And when there's almost none left, that's when you become protective of them. And so you develop, I think, this sense of place actually when that's threatened. So if I'm healthy, I just eat like a slob, but then when I don't feel good, that's when I realize I should take care of my body, right?
I feel personally attacked because I had an injury because I drink all this Mountain Dew. But keep going. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, so I think I agree with most of what you said,
right.
But I think it's kind of actually perhaps the other way around. I'm from Germany, and I think in Europe people have more of this sense of place and the implication that comes with it of stewardship of the environment.
Right.
Whereas the US is just too damn large, you can pollute anywhere and it disperses and it doesn't hit you quite as hard. And so as you have enough nature left, you don't really take care of it, but when it's, at the last moment when you are about to really lose it, that's when I think people pay more attention.
Yeah, I think I totally agree with you. And that was one of the other motivations for this project of like, how do we, communicate these sense of place values to actually get people to buy in earlier rather than later.
Yeah.
I think this push too, to understand, again, I love resilience theory and I understand why they want to push for us to have a planetary mindset of like, okay, we should be thinking about the Antarctic ice, because if it does melt, then it releases a bunch of methane and that creates all these problems all around the planet. It's not just, it'll get warmer. No, it'll fundamentally change the processes in different places. And that's the push for this more expanded understanding of value or natural values. And I think you're totally right that people typically just write them off as granted because they have this as like a personal experience that, okay, I have a history, I know it's always going to be available because I've had this connection with it for so long. And like, you're willing to threaten it, you're willing to do whatever to it because you just say, these things just naturally occur here. And eventually you're going to lose those things that naturally occur there because the processes that govern them and keep them in place are going to go away. And then the attitude will be, oh crap, I need to make changes. Originally, this had a speculative aspect to it where I said, okay, there will probably be 3 different types of responses to loss of sense of place values. One of them is to say, oh crap, maybe I've done too much, but I can still fix it because, I just have to, conserve on water for a little bit. And it's like, no. You fundamentally change the processes. They're not going to like just simply return by doing something that you used to do. You have to do a heroic effort to get them to turn back. That's one possible response. The second response is to just shrug your shoulders and say, technology is going to fix it for us. That's the other one that I'm concerned with. And then the third one is just acceptance. And then if you just accept it, then you're not going to be invested in any management projects. You're like, okay, everything's just always going to be crappy and it's always going to change. And so why should I be concerned about what's in my environment because I have no control over it. And so that is part of the motivation for where this project's coming from. And like people usually take sense of place values for granted until they're under threat. And once they lose them, they stop caring anymore about the things that are in their environment. And that's concerning, I think, to me, and I assume to everybody else as well. Yeah. But thank you. That is it.
Do you have any theories on you talk about these spatial values?
Right.
How do you explain within the same city how people within it, have their different especially Wichita here, we're very segregated.
Right.
It's very historically, seen in how the city was constructed. But it's just even within its own environment, like we were talking about, you have just the own little smaller environment, but we have also this weird, I feel like a lot of cities are experiencing this, where they're almost being like eaten from within.
Right.
With the suburbs and the house, you know? And what we're seeing is like almost an invasive environmental response, you know?
No, I think you, oh, sorry.
No, like, exactly, and he was perfect.
No, I think you're totally right, and I hate to give an example from Utah, because I know I'm in Kansas, but I've only been here for so long, and I've been on the job market ever since, because I knew that I was gonna have to be. But Salt Lake City is a perfect example to give you the type of explanation that you're looking for. So if you anybody ever been to Salt Lake City? So, if you ever go there, don't go there during the winter, because it's a bowl, and what happens is that you get this inversion that locks in all the carbon monoxide from all the vehicles, and your air quality is crap for a long time. But the thing is that it's a bowl, and if you want to guess where the historical redlining and all the poorer communities are, you would not be wrong to guess at the bottom of the bowl where the air pollution is the worst and that they have the least amount of resources. But I think this geographical understanding of like how we can break up even cities into smaller organizations to understand how they're interconnected. There's also, the reason why I like the Salt Lake as an example is because, don't know if anybody saw the Times article from like 5 years ago, but you know, the drying up of the Salt Lake exposes this crust, and it's full of these harmful contaminants, and like arsenic and things are just getting distributed over these historically marginalized groups and the poor people who can't even afford healthcare. And so there's this idea of like, as the lake dries up, you're going to lose the money that's associated with the brine trip industry. So there's one type of system that operates on a larger scale. There's also the health problems that are going to like cause more issues for the city that they're going to have to take care of. And so you really do see this nesting of processes and groups geographically. And that's why I like to think of these things more spatially, because they really start to reveal these historical connections between groups. Ecofeminism is another part. I really love indigenous philosophies, but ecofeminism is another area of environmental ethics I really like. Karen Warren has this great line about how when we think about environmental justice, we have to think about it in an we need to think about it in a historical, geographical context as something that has taken place at a specific place at certain times. And I'm sort of the same mindset with these sense of place values. We have to understand them in a historical context and also in a geographical place. And so I think understanding the interactions between all these different institutions and processes that lock it into the way that it is, I imagine the Kansas and Wichita itself has the same sort of structure to it, where there's the red line communities, where there's the industrial waste area, and who lives near it, and all the health hazards that are associated with it. That would be my guess. Did you want to follow up?
No, yeah, I have a follow-up. Where I was talking about like just the connection with life itself. Like a lot of this seems to be with just this one philosophy of whether you can own life or not. And I feel like that's a central aspect. People who think the environment is something I can make the environment something that I like. Like not really any animals like do that in such a mass process that we do. And I think that goes heavily with this. Is like I feel like one of the main differences is whether you think life is something you own or not. And I feel like the second you think life is ownable, you don't even respect your own life. Like you don't respect life itself.
No, that's perfect. So that's the relational value topic. That's the relational value idea, and that's also the indigenous philosophies thing that I was mentioning earlier. And if you're interested, Vandana Shiva, I don't know if anybody's ever heard of her, but she's really big into food ethics and also a physicist and just polymath. But she talks about these issues of biopiracy, and also like she takes real issue with seed patents of like, how can I patent a seed? A seed is something that's living. Why should I be able to own it? And so it's definitely that type of mentality. And why I said the motivation for this project is to try to present why we should care about sense of place values to the people who are like, you know what, I can rely on somebody to make sure that I always have access to Mountain Dew, and that I always will see the same thing, and somebody will take care of this. And it's like, if we lose those things, it's going to be abrupt. It's going to be irreversible in a number of different ways, and like, how can we convince it?
Big difference, I would say, like you have many examples
Yeah.
But when the environment becomes unlivable, untenable, they leave.
Oh, yeah.
But we now live in an environment, like you said, where we can't have that option anymore.
Right.
You
Yeah.
know?
People in Arizona
Migration
grow
no
grass.
longer exists the way it used to.
Yeah. No, thank you. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And that's sort of what I'm trying to channel here too, hopefully.
To sort of piggyback onto this question of like, what price you can put on things. I mean, your initial dichotomy was between intrinsic worth, right, and then instrumental.
Yes.
So then you've got relational values as a middle position between those things. But so my philosophical, critical worry here is that you're thinking of relational values in some way as not instrumental, right? And you're overly idealizing them. If I put it in Marx's terms, I think, when does the commodity form show up, right? So does the commodity form show up at the point where I have a relationship to something that is meaningful to me and valuable to me, or is it showing up later when I need to be able to convince people, right, that there's an intrinsic value here?
Right.
And I can say, and here's the commodity form version of this thing that we want to protect, and here's why it's valuable. So there's some slippage going on in the values assignations, right?
Yes.
And it seems to me like the notion of intrinsic value is doing a little more work here. And for that matter, the notion of instrumental value is also doing a little bit more work here.
Right.
So it's not simply that you want to avoid these two extremes, right? I mean, when you get a relation of value, you've already got a commodity form. Because if we're talking about experiences that we're having, I mean, we're 500 years into capitalism.
Right.
We don't have unmediated experiences anymore. So I guess another issue then is that when you do an analysis of an environment, you had what was the archy? The archy at the top.
Oh, panarchy?
When you have panarchy, right? And so you've got all these particular processes happening down here at the local level, and I liked how you situated local. I mean, there's stuff that local supervenes on, and then there's higher levels of organization. But when you make the analogy to how human communities work, it is still an analogy.
Yeah.
Because we, as operating within those systems, are already commodity fetishized. We're conscious actors. So, I mean, I think the model works, but I think there's adjustments when you go from the natural scale to the social scale.
No, I think you're absolutely right. So to your first question, you're totally right about relational value. I'm going to give you a bad answer, which is they've dealt with this in the literature, and I just sort of say, I'm accepting the position that relational value, yeah, I'm doing more hand-wavy stuff. But here's the longer answer to your question, though. You're right in that some people are concerned that relational values are just instrumental values in disguise.
Yeah.
They're really just, hey, yeah, I have these experiences with them, and I just want to like keep having those experiences with them. And so there are people who are defenders of intrinsic value who are like, this is just a nice gloss over instrumental values. But a lot of people who defend relational values say that there is this sort of unselfishness about the relational value. They're eudaimonic values insofar as like I see them as part of a flourishing life. And I think part of that, because care is the foundation for relational values, care can look different than exploitation. So like letting somebody go is an expression of care, in my opinion, just like letting, I think in an instrumental worldview, you would say, no, I need to hold on to it. I'll put it in any condition that I can as long as I can keep on having consistent access to it. And in reality, the care aspect of relational value is supposed to say there's something deeper interdependency related there.
Hey, can I jump on?
Yeah.
In the name of a relation of value, you could actually modify a system, right? Because you wouldn't be saying that its intrinsic value forbids me from interfering with it if by doing so I could enhance other values.
Right. Yeah. And so this is why I'm also, do I have it up there? No, I don't. There it is. The second one. So Brian Norton's a very famous environmental ethicist, if anybody's interested. He actually, I try to give credit where credit is due. So this idea of adaptive management has been around since about the 80s or 90s. He started to incorporate it into environmental ethics. And for some reason, it has really gone nobody has really engaged with it very much. But he's one of the most famous environmental ethicists, but nobody seems to engage with this aspect of his work. I don't know why. But in any case, he talks about how values are all scale dependent. And I give the example of, there are different relational values that can have different scales. Think about sports teams. I can root for Wichita State's baseball team. I can also root for the Cincinnati Reds baseball team. I can also root for the USA baseball team. You have a city, or you have a college team, you have a professional team that competes larger, you have a USA team that competes on a global scale, and so like I can have these values, and what Norton would say is, yes, they're indexed to a specific scale, and that scale of experience is going to decide if it's instrumental or intrinsic, depending upon how you interpret it. So I lean into the care aspect of relational value, and I think that's why I really emphasize that first part of the of relational values. Like, it's a strong motivator for action. You care about there's a care relationship there that really motivates you to act in a certain way. So yes, you're right to be concerned that maybe these are really just instrumental values in disguise, but there is that care aspect, and that's the one that I usually refer to.
So you're saying care is intrinsic then?
Well, so it's not going to be intrinsic either. It's going to be more.
It's not intrinsic to some object, but the notion of caring for, that would be an intrinsic value, regardless of what that for which I was caring.
Right. So yeah. Again, I agree with you, and this is why I'm just defaulting, because the literature on relational values has exploded. So I'm one of those people who's just like, I'm just gonna operate in the same sphere so I can talk to everybody, and if they're gonna shelf it, I'm gonna shelf it. But their argument to this is that relational value isn't bound to the particular bearer of the value, it's bound to the experiences with the relationships. So it's not even like my experience with the blue heron, my relational value is in the blue heron, it's with the experience of me experiencing it, which I'm not great at. It's not my favorite way of understanding, but that's how they get out of the distinction there. And if you don't mind, I just want to quickly address the second part of your question, because this was something that I had on my paper that I forgot to mention. The one thing that I really love about panarchy and adaptive cycles is that they get applied to social systems. So if you think about the structure of a government, we have a national government, we have a state government, we have a city government. Different aberrations at the city level can cause changes to the state level. State can also exercise constraint, and so you get these different dynamics between how these different institutions operate. And one of the really interesting things for me as an environmental ethicist and philosopher is that if you get really interested in resilience theory and some of the stuff that I showed you, there's this issue about scale mismatch. And what they try to argue is that there is this situation in which we have these institutions at certain spatiotemporal scales that don't match the things that they're actually governing over. So a good example is like a national forest. So a national forest can span more than one state. And each state makes its own policy about how to manage their portion of that forest. But if not all the states are on the same page, you're going to have an inconsistent management plan, and you're also going to likely not achieve the management goals that you're looking for. And so you have these institutions structured on these distinct spatiotemporal scales, and a lot of, if you're into the social system side of this, they'll talk about how
Rhode Island is a state, okay? Rhode Island is a state, and so is Kansas, right? This mismatch.
Right.
And then longitudinally, like you say, over time, it just gets, the gap gets wider and wider.
I just saw, I think it was a PBS, like, short news thing, but a cat that kept hopping over the USA-Canada border. I don't know if everybody saw that, but it's just like, it just doesn't observe. Like, that's what nature does. It doesn't really observe boundaries that we define and impose on it, and so you get these mismatches. But I just wanted to say that I think if you look at resilience theory, they talk about social ecological resilience. So there's ecological resilience, which I was pretty much showing you in here, but there's also the idea that social systems and environmental and ecological systems are embedded with one another. So the Great Salt Lake is an example where, you have brine shrimp within the lake. That brine shrimp, exists as its own thing in nature, but it's also a commodity that we trade in our own markets. And so if you lose the brine shrimp, you affect the social systems that depend upon it, and just like if you have that fall apart, you have the social systems in turn. So yes, there's the reason why I love this framework is that it's very adaptable to whatever you are thinking about in terms of processes and organization. And that's why, again, as somebody who likes to pretend to be a geographer. Incorporating this into a way in which we can understand value. I'm not the first one to do it. I don't want to take credit for that either, because there are a lot of great people who work on these issues, and my contribution is usually the geographical aspect. So if you look at anything that I write, there's always this geographical turn, and that's what I'm trying to do in this one. Working with two geographers for my PhD, I just always think about these things as spatially distributed things. Sorry, I'm hogging up the time, but I just want to say one other thing connected to this, which is that why I think the geographical aspect of this is important is that whenever we talk about climate issues or global issues, we talk about these models that are built on these aspatial processes, right? We talk about what CO2 levels would raise up, and we talk about how that could cause different processes to change in the atmosphere, which could trickle down into other systems. But in reality, there's a sense in which the spatial distribution of these systems can also change the dynamics of how these tipping points play out, which is what I'm really interested in. I really enjoy spatial resilience. That's a specific brand of resilience that I'm interested in, and that's sort of what's getting applied in this.
Going.
Well, before you get, thank you again. This has been very helpful, and I've really enjoyed talking with everybody. And yeah, just trying to get these ideas together in the past week has been a joy, but I've also been scared for the past like 5 days that I was going to ruin this. So hopefully, at least, no matter what, you got to see some really cool examples, and like you can take this outside and apply it to something. And see you in logic class on Tuesday.
Yeah.
Thank you.